Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're opening up a book that feels less like a history and more like a diagnostic manual, maybe even a blueprint for the world we're living in right now.
It's a really slim volume, but the density of the ideas is just staggering.
It really is.
We are looking at Terrorizing the Neighborhood, American Foreign Policy in the Post-Cold War Era by Noam Chomsky. And this edition also features a preface by James Kelman and an introduction by Linda Gray, which are both crucial.
They are. And we should probably clarify the mission of this deep dive right up front. I mean, we aren't here to do a standard book review.
Right.
And we're definitely not here to debate whether the author is, a saint or a sinner. That's not the point.
No, the point is to look at the systemic question this book poses. And it's a huge one. What happens when an empire, a global superpower, loses its primary enemy?
It's organizing principle.
It's organizing principle, exactly. Does it disarm? Does it scale back? Or does it just find new justifications to maintain its existing structure?
It's just about the closest thing you can get to a controlled experiment in geopolitics. I mean, think about it. For 40, almost 50 years, everything the United States did on the world stage was justified by one thing.
The Soviet Union.
The Red Menace, the evil empire. It was the universal excuse for everything from, propping up dictators to massive military spending.
And then almost overnight, between late 89 and early 90, that menace it evaporated.
It vanished. The Berlin Wall comes down, the Warsaw Pact dissolves, it's gone.
So the experiment is, what happens to the machine that was built to fight it? Does the military budget shrink? Do the interventions stop? Does America become a, quote, normal country?
Or, and this is the core of Chomsky's argument, does the system reveal its true underlying nature? Does it prove that the Cold War was never really the primary driver, but just the most convenient excuse?
That is the thesis we're digging into today. And to really do that, we have to look at something that sounds kind of abstract, but is incredibly concrete. We have to look at how legitimacy is manufactured.
That's the key.
How do the media, the government, and the class of experts work together, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, to build a version of reality that justifies state violence?
And that's why this isn't just a history lesson. This is a systems analysis of power. It explains that feeling of deja vu you get, why foreign policy feels like it's stuck in a repeating loop no matter who's in the White House.
Feels like we've seen this movie before.
Because the hardware is the same, they just update the software, the narrative.
Okay, so before we get into the invasions and the drug wars and all of that, we need to start with the lens itself, the preface.
By James Kelman, yes.
You said it's crucial, and I completely agree. A lot of people just skip prefaces to get to the main event.
And in this case, that would be a huge mistake. Kelman's essay is, it's foundational. It frames how we should even approach a text like this. It's about how to think, not just what to think.
He focuses on this idea of the expert. And it really jumped out at me because we live in a culture that, it almost fetishizes expertise. We're constantly told to trust the experts, listen to the science, stay in your lane.
And look, in many fields, that is excellent advice. If I need brain surgery, I absolutely want a neurosurgeon, not, a guy I met at the bus stop.
Right. I'm not going to crowdsource my appendectomy.
Exactly. But what Kelman and Chomsky argue is that foreign policy and international relations have been falsely categorized. They've been dressed up to look like a hard science, like something too technical for ordinary people to understand.
We've been convinced, or maybe conditioned, to think that understanding world affairs is as complicated as, say, quantum mechanics.
And that it should be left to the specialists in their ivory towers or their government offices. Kelman uses this incredible metaphor that I think really clarifies the whole thing, the locked boxes.
Yes, tell us about that.
He says, our education system essentially teaches us that all knowledge is divided up and stored in these separate, specialized, locked boxes. You've got the literature box over here, the economics box over there, the political science box in the corner.
And the teacher, or the professor, or the expert on TV, they're the ones with the keys.
They hold the keys, they'll graciously open one box for you, let you peek inside for a semester, maybe even touch a few things, and then they lock it right back up. And the implicit message is powerful.
This isn't for you.
This information belongs to the specialists. You're just a tourist here. Don't try to connect what's in this box with what's in that other box. That's not your job.
So then when we see a news report about, a bombing campaign in the Middle East or a coup in Latin America, our first instinct, the one we've been trained to have, is to pull back. We say, well, that looks pretty bad on the surface, but I'm sure it's much more complicated than I understand. The people in the suits, the ones with the security clearances, they must know things I don't.
That hesitation, that feeling of inadequacy,
Mhm.
that's the system working perfectly. It's a very subtle but profound form of disenfranchisement. It makes you a spectator in your own democracy.
But Chomsky's whole intellectual project pushes against that.
Completely. Kelman points out that at his core, Chomsky is a rationalist philosopher. He has a deep-seated belief in the what he calls the innate creativity and common sense of the human mind, of the ordinary person.
This is what Cullen calls the dual identity, right? It's fascinating. On the one hand, Chomsky is the Einstein of linguistics, a hyper-specialized scientist who revolutionized his field. He knows what genuine technical expertise looks like.
And precisely because he knows what real complex science looks like, he can see that foreign policy, isn't it? He argues that human affairs, questions of morality, of power, aggression, of who gets the resources, are actually, when you strip away the jargon, pretty simple.
They're accessible.
They're accessible to common sense. The bus driver, the nurse, the construction worker, the stay-at-home parent, they all possess the fundamental moral and intellectual equipment to judge whether an invasion is just or not.
If they can get access to the facts.
If they can see through the fog.
Yeah.
The expert class, in this specific context, exists to create that fog. Their job, in a systemic sense, isn't to clarify, it's to obfuscate. To make the simple pursuit of power look like a complex, benevolent, and unavoidable science.
So really the first step in reading this book and doing this kind of analysis is to reclaim our own intellectual agency, to say, I have the capacity to understand this.
It's the prerequisite. We have to decide to stop being passive spectators and start, as Kelman says, smashing the boxes to see how everything connects.
Okay, so let's take that common sense and apply it to the historical moment that this book captures, the pivot point. We're talking January 1990.
Let's set the scene. I mean, really try to put yourself there.
The Berlin Wall has literally just fallen a couple of months earlier. The Soviet Union is in a clear death spiral. The Cold War is, for all intents and purposes, over.
For anyone who wasn't there or who was too young, it is genuinely hard to overstate the feeling of optimism at that moment. The end of history was being declared.
And there was this very real, very mainstream discussion about a peace dividend.
A huge one. The logic was completely undeniable, right? We have spent trillions and trillions of dollars. We've built this colossal global military and intelligence apparatus, all for one reason, to fight the Soviets.
And now the Soviets are gone.
They're gone. Therefore, it's simple math. We should dismantle a huge chunk of that security state and spend that money, the dividend, on schools, on healthcare, on rebuilding our own infrastructure.
It's just common sense.
Yeah.
If the fire is out, you stop spraying water on the house, you can turn the fire hose off now.
But that is not what happened. In fact, what happened was the precise opposite. And this book, Terrorizing the Neighborhood, it captures that exact moment where the hope for a peace dividend was basically strangled in its crib.
And the event that did the strangling was the invasion of Panama, Operation Just Cause.
Which, as Linda Gray points out in her introduction, is so critically important, not because it was the biggest or bloodiest war the U.S. ever fought. It wasn't.
Not even close.
But because it was the first major U.S. military intervention after World War II that could not, under any circumstances, be justified by the Soviet threat.
You couldn't say, the Russians are coming to Panama. It doesn't even make sense.
It would have been laughed out of the room. The Soviet Union was struggling to keep the lights on and feed its own people. They weren't projecting power into Central America. So for the first time in 40-plus years, the U.S. government had to sell a war to its people without using its favorite time-tested excuse.
This is it. This is the controlled experiment. The ideological cover is blown. We get to see the system naked. We get to see what the machine really does when it can't blame everything on communism.
And this leads us right into the first major systems insight from the book, the justification shift. The system's remarkable ability to pivot its narrative on a dime.
Okay, so let's unpack the old design first. The system of justification, the software that ran from, say, 1945 to 1989.
It was almost laughably simple. It was a plug-and-play system. If the U.S. wanted to intervene in a country, and this was usually to overthrow a government that was a little too independent, or to protect corporate interests, or just maintain political control in a region, you just had to connect it, however tenuously, to the Red Menace.
You just had to scream communism.
That was it.
Yeah.
And Chomsky gives some truly incredible examples of how thin these justifications were and how readily they were accepted by the press and the political establishment.
He talks about Grenada in 1983.
Right. Grenada. Let's just pause on that. Grenada is a tiny island in the Caribbean. Its main export is nutmeg. At the time, it had a population smaller than Peoria, Illinois.
Okay, not exactly a geopolitical heavyweight.
Not exactly. Yet, General John Vesey Jr., who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military officer in the country, he went on public record saying that if the U.S. didn't invade Grenada, the Russians would use it to choke off Caribbean sea lanes and starve the United States of its oil supply.
That sounds completely insane, the idea that a nutmeg island was a mortal threat to the U.S. economy.
It is objectively insane. Or take the case of Nicaragua throughout the 80s. The Reagan administration relentlessly claimed that the Sandinista government was a Soviet proxy, a beachhead for communism in the Americas.
And if they weren't stopped.
The Russian bear would be standing at the Texas border. Chomsky notes they were literally making the claim that it was just a 2-day drive from Managua to Harlingen, Texas.
A 2-day drive. I'm just picturing a column of Soviet T-72 tanks stopping for gas in Mexico on their way to invade Houston.
It is utterly absurd when you look at it with any critical distance. But here's the crucial and frankly terrifying part of the system. It worked.
It worked.
It mobilized the population. It got the funding bills through Congress. It silenced most of the critics because who wants to be seen as soft on communism? Fear is an incredibly effective tool for manufacturing consent.
But then, boom, 1990. The fear of communism is gone. It's no longer a credible threat. That Red Scare software is obsolete. So does the system grind to a halt.
No. The system pivots instantly, just swaps out the software, the hardware, the military, the intelligence agencies. The impulse to intervene remains the same. But the justification, the user interface gets an update. The Red Scare is replaced by the drug scare.
Narco-terrorism, that became the new buzzword.
Exactly. The invasion of Panama wasn't about stopping the Reds. The official story was it was about stopping the drug lords. And that meant stopping one man in particular, Manuel Noriega.
Which brings us to the second big insight from the book. The absolute necessity of the manufactured villain. You can't have a good war without a really bad guy.
And the system is exceptionally good at casting that role. Manuel Noriega was, from a narrative standpoint, the perfect villain for the dawn of the 1990s. He was a dictator. He was deeply involved in the drug trade. He was an unsavory character by any measure.
The media went into overdrive. Chomsky quotes some of the press coverage, describing him as a demon worse than Attila the Hun. He wasn't just a political problem. He was portrayed as a direct menace to every child in America.
A pockmarked, machete-wielding pineapple of a man. The visual was perfect for TV.
But a deep dive like this, it requires us to ask the question that the mainstream media at the time didn't really want to touch. Where did this guy come from? Did he just materialize out of a cloud of sulfur in 1989, fully formed as a supervillain?
No, and this is the part of the story that the system has to erase to make the narrative work. As both Linda Gray and Chomsky meticulously point out, Manuel Noriega was on the payroll.
A CIA payroll.
For years, he was a long-time, high-level CIA asset.
This is the part that just gets memory hold in the official retellings. Back in the mid-'80s, when Noriega was stealing elections, when he was brutalizing his opponents, when he was up to his neck in the drug trade, the U.S. government knew all about it.
They didn't just know about it, they were working with him. He was our guy in Panama. He was incredibly useful, especially for helping the U.S. funnel weapons and support to the Contra rebels who were trying to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua.
So the drug dealing and the general thuggery.
And that was all just considered an acceptable overhead cost by the planners in Washington. It was messy, sure, but he was a strategic asset. He served the larger purpose.
So what changed? Why did he suddenly become public enemy number one in 1989? Did he become more of a drug dealer, more of a dictator?
No, not at all. He became independent. He started to drift from Washington's orbit. He became more of a Panamanian nationalist. He stopped taking orders as crisply as the Bush administration wanted. He was becoming unreliable.
This is such a crucial distinction for a systems analysis. The crime that actually gets you invaded, the line you cannot cross, isn't human rights abuse. It isn't even drug dealing. It's defiance. It's insubordination.
Correct. In the architecture of empire, a client state must remain a client. The moment a leader starts prioritizing their own national interests or their own personal power over the interests of the imperial center, they move from the asset column to the liability column.
And as soon as they're labeled a liability, the system initiates what we could call the monster protocol.
I like that, the monster protocol. The media takes its cue from Washington. Suddenly, the fact that he's a drug dealer A fact that was known and tolerated for years becomes the only thing that matters. The long history of U.S. support and collaboration is completely erased from the story.
The context is stripped away.
All of it. He is transformed into a two-dimensional caricature of pure evil. And this is a brilliant piece of perception management.
How?
Because it simplifies the world for the public. It turns complex geopolitics into a simple, moralistic comic book story. It's good versus evil. It presents you with a binary choice. Do you support our brave American troops, or do you support the machete-wielding, drug-dealing demon?
And of course, no one wants to be on the side of the demon.
Exactly. And that binary choice completely bypasses all the real difficult questions. It bypasses the question of Panamanian sovereignty. It bypasses the question of international law. And most importantly, it bypasses the embarrassing question of why we were supporting and funding this demon for the past decade.
But there's another layer to this intervention, another systemic function it served. It wasn't just about punishing Noriega or controlling the canal. It was about curing the American public of something.
Ah, yes. Insight number 3, curing the Vietnam syndrome.
Okay, now we need to define this term very carefully. Because when a normal person hears Vietnam syndrome, they think it means something good. They think it means we learned a valuable, painful lesson from Vietnam. Don't get stuck in pointless, bloody, unwinnable wars.
That's the common sense definition. That's how a moral person or a sane society would interpret that historical trauma. But in the elite circles, in the think tanks, in the State Department, in the planning documents that Chomsky analyzes, Vietnam syndrome is defined very differently.
It's seen as a pathology, a disease.
They literally view the public's reluctance to use military force as a sickly inhibition. That's a direct quote from the intellectual class of the time. It is a psychological defect in the population that inconveniently prevents the state from freely projecting power around the world.
That is just a staggering inversion of morality. They're saying that the public's desire for peace, born from a disastrous war, is a sickness that the government needs to cure.
Precisely. From the perspective of the systems managers, a public that's hesitant about war is a constraint. It's a bug, not a feature. It limits their options. If the people are constantly afraid of another Vietnam, they won't give their consent for the smaller, quicker interventions needed to, secure markets and keep client states in line.
So how do you cure the patient? How do you get the public to stop worrying and learn to love the bomb again, or at least the invasion?
You give them a win. You stage a quick, low-cost, decisive victory.
Yeah.
You pick a very weak opponent, like the tiny island of Grenada or a small, dysfunctional country like Panama. You go in with overwhelming force, you smash them, you make sure U.S. casualties are minimal, and then you stage a big victory parade.
It's like exposure therapy for war.
It's proof of concept. The goal is to demonstrate to both the American public and the world that the U.S. can still use military force effectively without getting bogged down in a quagmire. It's about restoring confidence in the military as a tool.
And Chomsky quotes the Wall Street Journal on this, which is so telling. It's not a military journal. It's the voice of the business and financial elite.
And that's the quote about clout, isn't it?
Yes. Right after the Panama invasion, the journal ran an editorial celebrating what it called the restoration of clout. But the really chilling line, the one that reveals the whole game, is where they wrote that the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from the world stage frees the United States to be more unconstrained in the exercise of violence.
Let's just sit with that phrase for a second. Unconstrained in the exercise of violence.
It sends a chill down your spine.
It's a direct admission that the Cold War wasn't just about defending against Soviet aggression. It was also about the Soviets acting as a constraint on us. They were the other big kid on the playground, and you had to be careful not to push them too far.
And with that restraint gone, the system felt this rush of confidence, this sense of liberation. The Vietnam syndrome was weakening. The feedback loop was now firmly established.
A successful intervention leads to a quick win. That win leads to glowing media praise and a boost in the polls. That leads to public acquiescence or even enthusiasm. And that grants the state more latitude, a longer leash for the next intervention.
It's a cycle that builds on itself. And it absolutely laid the groundwork for what came next. The invasion of Panama was the dress rehearsal for the first Gulf War a year later.
And the war on drugs was the training wheels for the war on terror a decade after that. The mechanisms were all tested and perfected.
Now, we need to address a trap that it's very easy to fall into here. It's easy to hear all this and think, okay, so the Republicans, Bush, Reagan, the military hawks, They're the bad guys. They're the ones driving this imperial machine.
But Chomsky is an equal opportunity critic. He doesn't let the other side of the aisle off the hook. In fact, he saves some of his most blistering and, I think, most important analysis for the so-called liberal doves.
This is absolutely essential for a proper systems view. If you only look at the openly aggressive faction, you miss how the system maintains its stability and its resilience. You need a loyal opposition to make it all work.
An opposition that doesn't actually oppose the fundamentals.
Exactly. And Chomsky's case study for this is David Broder, who, for decades, was a columnist at the Washington Post. For anyone who doesn't know, Broder wasn't some radical. He was the absolute dean of American political journalism, the voice of sensible, moderate establishment centrism.
And Broder was, in fact, critical of the Panama invasion. He wrote columns questioning it.
So wait, there was dissent? The system wasn't monolithic.
But you have to look at the nature of the dissent. This is the crucial part. Broder didn't argue that the invasion was illegal. He never said it was immoral. He never questioned the fundamental right of the United States to do it. He questioned its prudence.
What's the difference there? It sounds subtle.
It's the difference between everything and nothing. Prudence is a management question. It's a question of tactics and efficiency. Was it wise? Was it well executed? Did it cost too much money? Did it annoy our European allies? These are the kinds of questions a CEO might ask about a hostile takeover.
It's like criticizing a bank robber. Not for robbing the bank, but for parking the getaway car in a tow-away zone. I support the overall mission of the robbery, but the execution on the parking front was sloppy.
That is the perfect analogy. By confining the debate to the narrow grounds of efficiency and prudence, the liberal doves implicitly accept the core premise. The United States has the right to intervene in other countries whenever it deems it necessary. The only thing up for debate is how we do it.
And Broder, the voice of liberal reason, actually dismissed the argument that the U.S. had violated international law as gaseous and nonsense.
He did. He even cited the administration's own talking points, saying that things like protecting American lives and defending our territory were valid standards for invasion. Never mind the fact that Panama posed zero threat to American territory.
By accepting the government's framing of the issue, the liberal media effectively polices the boundaries of acceptable thought.
This is the box again, Kelman's locked box. The debate is allowed to rage, but only inside a tiny box labeled tactics. The much bigger, more important box labeled legality and morality is welded shut and thrown in the ocean.
And this creates the illusion of a vibrant, free, and adversarial press. You can turn on the TV and see the hawks and the doves arguing, and you think to yourself, wow, look at this robust debate we're having as a country.
But you don't realize that both sides fundamentally agree on the most important point. The right of the U.S. to manage the neighborhood, by force if necessary. They're just quibbling over the management style.
This brings us right to the issue of international law. Because the hypocrisy that Chomsky exposes here is, well, it's not even subtle, it's just blatant.
It's completely brazen, and you have to remember the timeline to really appreciate it. The U.S. invades Panama in December of 1989. Then, in August of 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait.
Less than a year later, and when Iraq invaded its much smaller neighbor, the United States government suddenly became the world's most passionate defender of international law.
All of a sudden, the sanctity of borders was sacred. National sovereignty was inviolable. Aggression was the ultimate crime against humanity, a crime that the entire world had to unite to punish. George H.W. Bush said, "This will not stand."
But when the U.S. had invaded Panama just months earlier,
the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to condemn the invasion as a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. It was a clear act of aggression. But the U.S. simply vetoed the Security Council resolution against it and completely ignored the General Assembly's condemnation.
So international law is a weapon. It's a very useful club to beat your enemies with, but it's not a set of rules that applies to the sheriff.
In this system, it is a tool, not a principle. It's used to legitimize our actions and delegitimize the actions of our rivals. But the hegemon, the dominant power, always reserves the right to be exempt from the rules. This is at the very core of what Chomsky means by the crisis in perception. We perceive ourselves and we project ourselves as the upholders of the law, even at the precise moment we are dismantling it.
And the media plays a huge role in maintaining that perception. I highly doubt many Americans at the time saw front-page headlines that said, UN overwhelmingly condemns U.S. aggression in Panama.
Of course not. If it was reported at all, it was buried on page A17. And it would have been framed as, the UN is full of anti-American dictatorships or third world resentment. The raw facts are always filtered through the ideological lens of the system.
Okay, let's pause here and do what we promised. Let's actually map this out explicitly. If we stop looking at this as a historical story and start looking at it as a diagram of a machine, what are the components?
Let's build the schematic.
First, we have the actors, the moving parts.
At the very top, you have the state executive, the White House, the Pentagon, the CIA working in concert with elite interests. That means major corporations, financial institutions, the people who actually benefit from a stable, open global market. Their primary incentive is control. Control of markets, resources, and labor. They are the ones who initiate the policy.
Okay. Underneath them, or maybe alongside them, you have the media and the intellectual class, the experts.
They function as the interface or the priesthood. Their role is to translate the raw, often ugly material interests of the elites into a noble moral language that the public can accept. They are the ones who turn, "We want to maintain control of the Panama Canal and send a message to other disobedient leaders," into, "We are on a righteous crusade to stop a narco-terrorist and restore democracy."
Then you have the public. Where do we fit in?
In this model, the public is largely the object of the propaganda, not the subject of the democracy. We are viewed by the planners as empty vessels, or as confused children who need to be guided. We have to be frightened into compliance with scary stories or dazzled and distracted by the spectacle of a quick military victory. Our consent is something to be manufactured, not earned through honest debate.
And finally, the target states. Panama, Nicaragua, Grenada.
They are the resources and the territory. They are either assets or liabilities. They are allowed to have their own governments and function, but only as long as they serve the needs of the larger system. The moment they try to exit that system through genuine nationalism or independent economic development, they trigger the system's enforcement mechanisms.
Which brings us to the tools in the machine's toolkit.
They have a range. You start with things like economic strangulation and sanctions. You use propaganda to isolate them on the world stage. But if those fail, you escalate to the hard power tools. Covert action, and as a last resort, direct military intervention.
And crucially, the feedback loops that keep the machine running.
This is the most critical part for understanding why it's a system. A successful intervention, like the one in Panama was deemed to be, generates positive feedback. It creates political capital for the president. It weakens the domestic opposition, the so-called Vietnam syndrome. It justifies the next round of military budget increases. This feedback loop ensures that the system doesn't just run, it learns and reinforces itself. It feeds itself.
It's a self-perpetuating machine. And as we saw in 1990, even when its original fuel source, the Soviet Union, runs out, it's efficient enough to just switch fuel tanks and keep right on going.
But, and this is an important but, Chomsky and Gray don't just leave us trapped in the belly of this beast. The book offers a contrast. It provides a brief but powerful glimpse of a different way of organizing power.
You're talking about the section on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua with the Mosquito Indians.
Yes. This is the counter-system case study, and it's fascinating.
So Linda Gray sets the scene. You had the Sandinistas, the left-wing revolutionaries who had overthrown the brutal U.S.-backed Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. In the context of the Cold War, they were the good guys for a lot of people on the left.
But when these revolutionaries went to the Atlantic coast of the country where the indigenous Mosquito population lives, a very different culture, different language, they made a classic mistake. They acted like the very empire they had just defeated.
They came in with a top-down approach.
A very arrogant top-down approach. They essentially thought, we are the enlightened revolutionaries. We have the correct ideology. We know what is best for you primitive people. We are going to integrate you into our modern socialist state. They didn't listen, they didn't respect the local culture or history.
And the Mosquito people, unsurprisingly, pushed back hard. They actually took up arms and rebelled against the Sandinistas.
It was a complete disaster for the Sandinistas. It was a moral and military failure. But, and here is the fundamental difference between a genuine revolutionary movement, however flawed, and a rigid imperial system. The Sandinistas eventually realized they have failed. They did something almost unheard of for people in power. They admitted they were wrong.
And they completely changed their approach.
They pivoted 180 degrees. They shifted from that top-down model to a bottom-up one. Gray describes this incredible, painstaking autonomy process. They didn't just show up and hold a Western-style election. They went door to door, village by village. They went into communities and asked a simple, radical question. What do you want? How do you want to be governed?
And the initial reaction of the people is so telling. Gray notes that, at first, many of the Mosquito people didn't know how to answer. They'd say things like, I don't know, you're the government, you tell me.
They had been conditioned for centuries to be passive recipients of power, just like Kelman described in the preface about our own education. They were waiting for the experts from the Capitol to open the box and tell them what to do.
But the Sandinistas kept at it. They engaged in this years-long grassroots consultation, and eventually the people themselves designed their own plan for regional autonomy.
This connects directly back to Kelman's and Chomsky's core belief in common sense. When they were finally given the space, the respect, and the opportunity, these ordinary people demonstrated that they were perfectly capable of designing a sophisticated system of self-governance that fit their unique cultural and historical needs.
And the contrast with the U.S. approach in Panama couldn't be more stark. We didn't ask the Panamanian people what they wanted. We kicked in the door, killed thousands of civilians, installed a new government that was friendly to our banking interests, and then we flew home and called it Operation Just Cause.
The U.S. imposed a top-down solution. The Sandinistas, after a huge mistake, facilitated a bottom-up solution. And this reveals the core systemic conflict. The empire fundamentally fears bottom-up power.
Why? What's so threatening about it?
Because if people are allowed to decide for themselves, they might make decisions that conflict with the interests of the empire. They might decide to use their land to grow food for their own people rather than growing bananas or coffee for export to American consumers. They might decide to nationalize their oil or their mineral resources.
It might set a good example.
That is the ultimate threat, the threat of a good example. If one small country successfully breaks away from the system and charts its own path of independent development, it sends a powerful signal to all the other countries in the neighborhood. It says, look, they did it. It's possible. Why can't we? That is the contagion the system is designed to stamp out at all costs. And that is why independent nationalism is treated as the ultimate crime.
So let's pull all this into the present day. We're looking at a book that's over 30 years old, analyzing an event from 1990. Why does this specific systems analysis still matter so much to a listener right now?
Because the hardware, the underlying architecture of the system, hasn't fundamentally changed. That concept we hear about all the time in the news today, the rules-based international order, the DNA of that concept was solidified in this 1990 moment.
The selective enforcement of the rules.
It's the same pattern, playing out over and over. We see economic sanctions being applied to official enemies for, say, human rights violations, while official allies commit the exact same violations with complete impunity and continued U.S. support. We still see the media rallying around the flag during every manufactured crisis, narrowing the debate down to prudence and tactics rather than justice and legality.
And that justification shift is still fully active. It's the system's core competency.
Absolutely. We went from communism to the drug scare. Then from the drug scare to the terror scare after 9/11, now we're shifting again into an era of great power competition with Russia and China. The narrative skin changes, the enemy is updated, but the skeleton of the system, the global network of military bases, the massive arms sales, the inherent right to project force, that remains constant.
And the media box that Kelman described is arguably even more powerful now. We have access to more information than at any point in human history, but does that mean we have more understanding? Or are we just drowning in a more sophisticated, more fragmented, more personalized form of noise?
I would argue the crisis in perception is deeper than ever. We are surrounded 204/7 by what Chomsky calls necessary illusions. We genuinely believe we are seeing the world as it is through a clear window, but we are actually watching a highly curated performance on a screen.
A play that's being presented as a documentary.
That's a great way to put it. And all the actors, the politicians, the generals, the cable news pundits, they are very good at staying in character.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what is the big picture takeaway? We've looked at the machinery, we've seen the pivot from Cold War to drug war, we've mapped the actors and the feedback loops. What does this book ultimately help us see?
I think the biggest takeaway circles right back to where we started, with James Kelman in the preface. It's about agency.
The refusal to be a passive spectator.
Yes. The entire system of propaganda and control is designed to make you feel small. It's designed to make you feel that these issues are too big, too complex, and happening too far away for you to possibly understand, let alone influence. It relies on your passivity. It needs you to stay in your box.
But Chomsky and Kelman's central argument is that this feeling of powerlessness is a lie.
It's the foundational lie. They argue that the emperor really has no clothes. Once you see the structure, once you understand the formula, how the villain is manufactured, how the justification is shifted, how the debate is contained, You can't be so easily tricked anymore. You stop accepting the villain of the month club.
It's a call for a kind of intellectual self-defense, a call to trust your own common sense, and to be deeply skeptical of the experts who tell you that war is peace, that invasion is liberation, and that submission is freedom.
The end of the Cold War was a mask-off moment for the system. For a brief instant, it showed us the true face of power without its primary excuse. And we shouldn't forget what we saw.
I want to leave our listener with one final thought to mull over. A provocation, really, that comes directly out of this analysis.
Go for it.
If the designated enemy of the system can be swapped out overnight, from a nuclear-armed superpower that defined global politics for half a century to a single tin-pot dictator in Panama, but the policy of military intervention remains exactly the same, what does that tell you about the true purpose of the policy?
Is it actually about defense? Or has it always fundamentally been about enforcement?
Something to think about the next time you see a new crisis breaking on the news.
Indeed.
This deep dive was based on Terrorizing the Neighborhood, American Foreign Policy in the Post-Cold War Era by Noam Chomsky, published by AK Press and Pressure Drop Press.
It's dense, it's challenging, and I think it's an absolutely essential read. We highly recommend grabbing a copy from your local library, or if you can, from an independent bookstore.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
Stay curious.